At midday on February 2, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft circled over the city. The pilot's radio message was immediately passed to Field Marshal Milch. No more sign of fighting in Stalingrad. After Voronov and Rokossovsky's first interview with Paulus, Captain Dyatmarenko returned to interrogating the other captured generals. Contrary to his expectations, they reacted in very different ways. General Schlomer, who had taken over command of 14th Panzer Corps from Hoob, arrived limping on a stick and wearing a Red Army padded jacket. He won over his interrogator with an easy charm and remarks about the corporal uneducated in military problems and the untalented careerists in his entourage. General Walther von Seydlitz, on the other hand, whom the NKVD later discovered to be the most energetic defender of disobedience to the Führer during the encirclement, conducted himself in a very reserved way. For Stalin, 91,000 prisoners, including 22 German generals, were better trophies than flags or guns. Paulus, still in a state of shock, at first refused to appear in front of the journalists brought down from Moscow. "We have our own rules," retorted Colonel Yakimovich of Don Front headquarters, with Lieutenant Beziminsky interpreting. "You are to do what you are told." One compromise was, however, permitted. Paulus would not have to answer questions from the journalists. He only had to show himself to prove that he had not committed suicide. The foreign correspondents were rather surprised by the appearance of the German generals. "They looked healthy and not in the least undernourished," wrote Alexander Wirth. Clearly, throughout the agony of Stalingrad, when their soldiers were dying of hunger, they were continuing to have more or less regular meals. The only man who looked in poor shape was Paulus himself. He looked pale and sick and had a nervous twitch in his left cheek. Attempts to put questions were not very successful. It was rather like being at the zoo, where some animals showed interest in the public and others sulked. General Dubois was clearly keen to please and immediately told the foreign journalists, as if to ask us not to be frightened, that he was Austrian. General Schlomer was the most relaxed. He turned to one of his captors and, "For the Wehrmacht, it was a time of counting the cost." Field Marshal Milch's staff estimated that they had lost 488 transport planes and 1,000 crew members during the airlift. The 9th Flak Division was destroyed, along with other ground personnel, to say nothing of 4th Air Fleet's losses in bombers, fighters, and Stukas during the campaign. The Army's exact losses are still uncertain, but there was no doubt that the Stalingrad campaign represented the most catastrophic defeat hitherto experienced in German history. The 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army had effectively been destroyed. In the Kessel alone, some 60,000 had died since the start of Operation Uranus, and around 130,000 had been captured. Again, the confusion over statistics appears to be due mainly to the numbers of Russians in German uniform. These figures do not take into account the losses in and around Stalingrad between August and November, the destruction of 4 Allied armies, the defeat of Manstein's rescue attempt, and the losses inflicted by Operation Little Saturn. Altogether, the Axis must have lost over 500,000 men. Presenting such a catastrophe to the German people was a challenge to which Goebbels had risen with frenetic energy, using all his talent for shameless distortion. The regime had not admitted that the 6th Army was encircled until 16th January, when it spoke of "our troops who for several weeks have been heroically fighting enemy attacks on all sides." Now, it chose entirely the opposite direction, claiming that not a single man had survived. Goebbels mobilized wireless stations and press to unite the country in martial grief. His instructions to newspapers on how they were to portray the tragedy poured forth. They must remember that every word about this dramatic struggle would go down in history. The press must always employ the word Bolshevik, not Russian. The whole of German propaganda must create a myth out of the heroism of Stalingrad, which is to become one of the most treasured possessions in German history. The Wehrmacht communiqué, in particular, must be phrased in a way which will move hearts for centuries to come. It had to rank with Caesar's address to his troops before the Battle of Leuthen, with Frederick the Great's appeal to his generals before the Battle of Leuthen, and with Napoleon's call to his imperial guard. The communiqué was broadcast as a special announcement on the wireless 24 hours after Strecker's surrender. From Führer headquarters, February 3, 1933. The Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht announces that Paul himself seems to have sensed before the surrender that the regime might try to twist the Stalingrad disaster into a new version of the stab-in-the-back myth. Whether this influenced his decision to refuse the surrender terms on 9 January is impossible to say. This time, however, the scapegoats for defeat would not be communists and Jews as in 1918, but the general staff and the aristocracy, still closely associated in the popular mind. Those about to come into the line of fire had an inkling of the storm ahead. Otto Fürst von Bismarck, the German minister at the embassy in Rome, slipped away with his wife for a holiday at the end of January to avoid the official celebrations of the Nazi regime's 10th anniversary. Like most German diplomats away from Berlin, he had little idea of the true horrors of the Stalingrad debacle. On the evening of 31st January, they were in the Palace Hotel in St. Moritz when an urgent telephone call from the German ambassador in Bern was put through. "Stop dancing," the ambassador warned. "Stalingrad has fallen." They both knew that St. Moritz had become the favorite resort of senior officers of the SS. Nothing more needed to be said. The propaganda ministry's party line about general and grenadier fighting shoulder to shoulder soon changed. On 18th February, Goebbels organized a mass rally in the Berlin Sportpalast with the theme, "Total War, Shortest War." A huge banderole carried the great call of 1812, "Let our war cry be, now the people rise up and storm break loose." These very different historical contexts made this glaringly inappropriate to all but the most committed supporter of the regime. "Do you want total war?" Goebbels yelled from the podium. His audience bayed its response. "Are you determined to follow the Führer and fight for victory, whatever the cost?" Once again, the party faithful roared. Goebbels, during the weeks following Stalingrad, set the agenda. He demanded an end to half measures with mass mobilization, yet symbolism was almost more important in the rash of measures. The copper cladding over the Berlin Gate was removed for use in war industry. Professional sporting events were banned. Luxury shops, including jewelers, were closed. All fashion magazines were to cease publication. Goebbels even organized a campaign against fashion with the notion that women did not need to dress up because they would please victorious homecoming soldiers just as much in patches. Rumors spread that permanent waving would be forbidden. Hitler, who passionately believed that it was the duty of womankind to be decorative, objected to this, and Goebbels was forced to announce that there is no need for a woman to make herself ugly. Barter, that first sign of a siege economy, spread rapidly. Scrubbing brushes, for example, were soon exchanged for tickets to a Furtwängler. The only overt sign of disaffection following the collapse at Stalingrad came from a small group of Munich students known as the White Rose. Their ideas spread to other students in Hamburg, Berlin, Stuttgart, and Vienna. On 18 February, after a campaign of leaflets and slogans painted on walls calling for the overthrow of Nazism, Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans were arrested after scattering more handbills at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Tortured by the Gestapo, then sentenced to death by Roland Freisler at a special session of the People's Court in Munich, brother and sister were beheaded. A number of other members of their circle, including the professor of philosophy Kurt Huber, suffered similar fates. Soon after the final surrender at Stalingrad, Hitler saw Field Marshal von Manstein, the first senior officer from outside his immediate circle. Meinstein outlined the measures he had been forced to take to avoid total collapse in southern Russia. Hitler wanted to order him not to withdraw any further, but Meinstein knew that in the circumstances he could set the terms. During their discussions, Hitler said he alone took the responsibility for Stalingrad, then promptly sidestepped his own confession by adding that he could put some of the blame on Göring. Since he had appointed the Reich Marshal to be his successor, he could not hold him responsible for Stalingrad. No mention was made of his own confused strategy and attempts to control operations from afar. His greatest recriminations were still reserved for Paulus. He told Goebbels that after the war he would have Paulus and his generals court-martialed for failing to carry out his explicit order to resist to the last bullet. Hitler now seldom held forth at table, as had been his habit. He preferred to eat alone. Guderian found him greatly changed. His left hand trembled, his back was bent, his gaze was fixed, his eyes protruded but lacked their former luster. His cheeks were flecked with red. But when Hitler met Milch, he showed no regret for the vast waste of life at Stalingrad. He could think only of raising the stakes once again, throwing away even more lives. "We will end the war this year," he told him. "I have accordingly decided on a gigantic mobilization." Red Army generals were conspicuously rewarded. The recent suspension of dual command with commissars was crowned with the formal reinstatement of the rank and description of officer. The euphemism commander was dropped. As General Schlomer had noted with amusement, shoulder boards, symbols of privilege which some Bolshevik lynch mobs in 1917 had nailed to the bodies of their czarist wearers, were reinstated. Gold braid had been secretly ordered from Great Britain, to the astonishment and disapproval of officials there. One soldier in a guards division heard the news about shoulder boards from an old man polishing boots in a railway station. "They're starting these gold shoulder boards once more," the man told him in angry disbelief. "Just like in the White Army." His fellow soldiers, too, were amazed when he told them the news on returning to the train. "Why in the Red Army?" they asked. Such mutterings were ignored. The new decorations for the Great Patriotic War, the orders of Suvorov and of Kutuzov, were also distributed to senior commanders in the campaign. The greatest propaganda success, however, extended far beyond Soviet